Thank you, Ben. So after your gloom and doom scenario, I'm going to add to it, I'm afraid. Look, the basic premise of Ben's presentation I can't disagree with. Nobody who's paying attention can deny that there's some pretty big games going on in the Asia Pacific. The stakes have rarely been larger, and it's happening at a moment of enormous dynamic change, natural in those circumstances for parties to test each other when relative strengths are changing. I'm going to try and steer clear of talking about the US. I'll leave that a little bit to Tom. I'm going to try and give my 2 cents on what China's about. How does it think? What are Chinese strategic intentions and capabilities? And I probably won't leave you with a kind of clean answer to those questions, but I just want to perhaps provide a little window into some ways to think about the questions, which I don't think are some issues, some questions, some habits, some peculiarities about China, which I don't think are widely understood. Now, what is China on about in the military security arena in the Asia Pacific? Well, last year, a guy called James Fennell, he's the director of intelligence at the US Pacific Fleet in Honolulu. And so this guy, there's probably nobody in the world, including in China, that has as much capacity to crunch data, to analyse data. So every morning before dawn, he gets his team together. There's historians, linguists, techno guys, a million sort of data crunchers, as well as all the kind of the strategic war analysts. They all sit around the table and they say, okay, what happened in the last 24 hours? And as he put it on the record in a conference early last year, every day, and his territory extends basically from San Diego to Madagascar, every day it's about China. What's China doing? It's China changing, upsetting the status quo somewhere in the region. So that is actually the only game around when it comes to security in our region. Everything else is a byproduct of that in some ways, or a response to that in some ways. And his view was, and bearing in mind his position and the capacity he has to look down on all sorts of things that you and I can't, his view was that China is intent on challenging US power in the Pacific. It's going to see, and it's testing itself for the purpose of fighting war. And his view was this is reflected not just in the PLA Navy, but in all sorts of lesser security, lesser kind of forms of security work, including the maritime surveillance agencies, which he says are intent, in fact, 100% focused on harassing its neighbours into submitting to, I think, roughly quoting, China's expansionist territorial claims. So that's the head of US intelligence in the US Pacific Fleet. 3 weeks ago, he returned to San Diego for the same conference, and he gave an update on that view. And he said, looking at, and he's relying here on public source, open source documents, he says, looking at what China was doing last September, October in its drills around the East China Sea and further down south in Guangdong, in Fujian and Guangdong, tens of thousands of PLA troops involved, across Navy, Air Force. He says what China was preparing to do was preparing for a short, sharp invasion of the Senkaku Islands. And so that's, you cannot, I don't think, just disregard somebody in that position. And then 2 weeks ago, another guy, a US analyst who's his credentials are similarly sort of impeccable. He's a former US defense attaché in Beijing. He was a former lieutenant general, a guy called Dennis Blacksoe. And he got up and said, well, actually, James Fennell was 100% wrong, completely wrong. What China was actually doing in these drills, at the end of last year, was preparing for a natural evolution of conventional modernisation, military modernisation, and the drills were squarely aimed at defending Chinese sovereignty from external attack. So here you have perhaps the two best positioned people outside of China coming to exactly the opposite conclusions about what China's strategic intentions are. And I just think that's illustrative of a reasonably difficult topic that we're talking about today. What does China think? No country in the world goes to such lengths to make itself more opaque, with the exception of North Korea, and perhaps no country in the world has so deeply ingrained in its system that one of its key strategic aims is to be strategically confusing. So how do we sort through that? Well, I'm not going to give you the answer, but I'm going to give you a couple of little anecdotes to perhaps shed some light on some aspects of it. So last year, so my job, the last 6 years, has been the greatest job that I'll ever have in my life, and it was just walking around China trying to work out what was going on. So part of my job as a China correspondent was to try and engage with some of these military folk, usually completely unsuccessful. Occasionally you have some luck, bearing in mind that this is anybody who's licensed in barbarian handling, as they put it in Chinese. There's only a couple dozen of them related to the military in China. So they're there to do their jobs. Everybody that talks, with the exception of some children of generals, at Harvard or something like that, anybody who talks with knowledge from inside the Chinese system is there for the purpose of sending a message. And only kind of fudges around the edges, and it's around the edges where you've got to kind of work the hardest and work out, okay, what was that? What was that unintentional message, or what was really going on there? So one of these guys who and these guys say there's a couple of dozen of them who are licensed to handle barbarians. On one side you have the hawks, and we read about them every second week. These are the guys that say what China needs to do is to set fire to the South China Sea and teach the Philippines a lesson once and for all. And then once we've established the status quo, the hierarchy of the region, harmony can prevail, and everybody welcome into our regional order. So they're the hawks, and on the other side there are the doves, and these are the guys that are more likely to be found in the International Relations Department at Peking University, and these guys are always going on about these hawks, they don't speak for the Chinese system, they're off their brain, nobody listens to them, don't treat them seriously, certainly I don't, they're all mad. And so you have the doves talking still about the peaceful rise, and actually these guys, in Beijing are really smart, and none of that's going to happen. So I think the important point to note is both of those messages are within this is an orchestra. So everybody is, most people, I think, speaking within the system are also individuals, and to some extent they sort themselves out about where they stand on the spectrum. But everything that comes out externally and publicly, more or less, is part of the orchestra, part of the message that we're meant to hear, even when it's mutually contradictory. And so, for example, what is the how do you reconcile the Daishoos who say that they want to set Senior Colonel Daishu wants to set fire to the South China Sea, and recently he's been banging on about the Diaoyu Islands in a similar way, with the Zhufengs at Peking University who say the opposite? Well, I think that there are a few messages that the Chinese military political establishment wants to push out, and they are mutually contradictory, but they're each useful at different points of time. One is that China is and always has been a peaceful power. So whatever China does, we should interpret this in the light of China's 5,000-year history of benevolent behaviour in its region, and that's the way it will always be. That's one. Two, written in smaller kind of print, is China is actually really dangerous, and if you don't watch out, it's going to really hurt. And three, and I think this is probably the most important, and this is the part that almost everybody buys, and I'd also kind of urge a little, that it requires a little bit of discounting, is that China's rise, meaning the CCP's rise, is inexorable. It's upwards and onwards, and it is fact. So these messages, this is not a debate that goes on in China. This is ideological fact. These are, before you begin the conversation, these are the parameters of the debate. No point contesting, talking, dialoguing about any of these things because they're set. Of course, there are individuals and have your private conversations, and they can be very rewarding, and sometimes they can be true. But in the national public diplomacy, I think it's worth keeping those things in mind. So last year, one of these guys that I'd been kind of trying to dance in front of his window going, hi, I'd like to be your friend, was, oh, gee, I've admired your books, and wasn't that an interesting comment you made? So and he actually turned out to be a terrific guy, and I'll fudge some of the identifying details, but senior officer in the PLA, one of the licensed barbarian handlers, definitely not on the dovish side of the spectrum. And so he invited me over to the Chinese New Year event at his house. And I was absolutely stoked. And I thought, wow, I'm going to meet my first 3-star general, and maybe Liu Yuan, the son of Liu Shaoqi, will be there, who I've been trying to write a book about. And it was all very kind of exciting. And even more so when he said, look, if you don't mind, I've got some kind of suggestions about how you come into our barracks. And this is just down in West Beijing, off Chang'anjie, off the main street alongside Tiananmen Square. And he said, I suggest you wear a big hat and you pull it low over your eyes, and a big collar or a scarf, better still a scarf, wrapped around your face, and just slink down low in the back seat of the car and look out the other way when you get to the military checkpoint at the barracks. And so, wow, cool. And so I did. And, a little bit nervous because I've never known, maybe we never find out what happens to the people who don't pass that test. And in we went to this great military barracks, and the nice kind of 60s building, a bit like Canberra actually, and down to the end of the road, got out. We obviously got past the kind of the heavy security area, and this lovely old guy, he's out of his car key now, and invites us up to what I thought was going to be a Spring Festival party with all his general mates, and it turned out to be just him and his wife, and his wife is making dumplings for Chinese New Year, and we kind of had his bit of kind of a sip of his Huangzhou with terrible plum wine, and some aguatol, which is even worse, and as a terrific occasion. So he wanted to, and he showed me a couple of things, and he wanted me to see all the things that he'd been quoted in, and did you know that Henry Kissinger even quoted me in his book, and so he had this big pile of kind of the ego files. And he also wanted to tell me, this is in Spring Festival last year, and he also wanted, the message he wanted to give me was that, Australia, we all like Australia, we're all so friendly, we all think so fondly of Australia, we've all been there, we've all got relatives who are studying there or laundering their money through apartments in Melbourne. And could you, but it's, would be really, really, would feel really sorry for them if they didn't understand. And what they need to understand in Australia is, we really like you, but you understand that we're the ones that provide, we butter your bread. And China is rising. We're not in a hurry. We understand you've got your kind of your legacy relationships, and we understand that you can't, these things take time, politics takes time to shift, but all you need to do at this stage is just understand that you can't separate the economics and the politics anymore. We love buying your iron ore, we love funding your higher education system and your tourism industry, and that's just because we're nice Chinese people, but it's going to be impossible for us to do that if, for example, you got involved in the wrong way with the Jiaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. Now, back then, that was a hawk's view. That was an extreme view, whereas, if there's an ideology in Australia, it is that we don't have to choose. So here was this hawk saying, we do have to choose, and I think 12 months on, that is no longer, it's no longer the hawks that are saying that. So at the end of last year, we had a 1.5 track bilateral meeting between China and the US, and I kind of was one of the flies on the wall, and mixture of senior people and sort of senior has-been people from both sides, all talking around the table. And the message, it was the full orchestra. China is friendly. China's always been a peaceful country, and as of right now, Australia really has to choose. All that, the old kind of, have your cake and eat it too. Have your security relationship with Washington, and keep flogging your iron ore to China. Not anymore. It's it's a new era. So it could not have been clearer. It was a 2.5-hour symphony from some very sophisticated diplomats. So what was the hawkish view a year ago is now the main message that's been banged into the Australian system, behind closed doors and occasionally in public. So we're in a new era in terms of Chinese strategic expectations for Australia. Back to my dumplings, and they were very good. This guy comes from Shandong, and his wife makes very nice handmade dumplings. There's lots of things I've been interested in the old Chinese families and the leaders in power, who their daddies were, and I find that stuff all very exciting. And there was the guy I mentioned at the start of the talk, a guy called General Liu Yuan, the son of President Liu Shaoqi, which happens to be a particularly close friend of Xi Jinping, and a particularly interesting character. The year before, in 2012, a friend of his had conjured to give me a copy of a speech, which was the most radical, interesting speech I've ever read from inside the Chinese system, precisely because it was not designed for me. This was not through the barbarian handling system. But what that speech did was this is how at least one top Chinese military leader thinks, and it is completely different to the world as described by James Fennell and Dennis Blacksoe over in Washington. One, it was there in black and white. No country can invade China. That's not what we're here for. The PLA is not a self-defense force in the way that it is usually publicly advertised from China. But then the next section of his speech was that it's got a very important purpose, and the easiest way to breach a fortress is from within. Now I thought, well, that's interesting. I've read that before, and I went back and sure enough, it's in Stalin's short course of Bolshevism from 1937, which all these guys' fathers grew up on in the 30s, 40s, and particularly the 50s, but into the 60s. So the PLA, and this speech was an extraordinary speech, but it was all about how do we stop the PLA turning against us. How do we stop the hostile Western forces from infiltrating our fortress, spreading their polluting ideas about liberalism, about democracy, splitting and disintegrating us, like pretty much every dynasty that's come on before, right? That's actually what PLA leaders are thinking about, and certainly the political leaders who are in charge of the PLA for 70% of their military time is how do we stop the PLA misbehaving in a way that's militarily not only disadvantaged, but it's not going to kill us all, because that's the sort of dynastic, I think, framework in which a lot of questions are framed. So where does that leave us? And why I led to this guy was when I was looking through his pile of the Colonel's pile of cuttings, there was also on his desk the handwritten speech, the speech that I'd seen the previous year from Liu Yuan, and it was annotated, dear Colonel so-and-so, from General Liu Yuan. And I thought, well, I didn't meet the guy, but at least I kind of see that his speech is real, and there it is in the red letter documents. And the other part of that speech is all about corruption. And this is actually what I was ended up talking the whole night about with the Colonel, that corruption is so serious in the PLA that it's almost got to the stage where it's dysfunctional in the sense that you cannot trust that commanders will be able to integrate with commanders from other parts of the system, and the vertical command chains, are they 100% reliable? These are key concerns within the PLA. This is not a force that's ready, as James Fennell at the Pacific Fleet would lead us to believe, to push back the US Pacific Fleet. They've got a lot of the toys, some of the best war toys you can buy anywhere or you can steal, and they but the difference between having all these toys and using them as a professional fighting force, training for war, and training at risk, at sea, at dark, in tilting seas, trying to work out how aircraft carriers work, that took 30 years for the United States. In the Chinese political system, it's longer and it's harder. So this is not anything yet like a professional modern blue water navy, as I think some people are leading us to believe. But does this mean it's all imaginary? It doesn't matter? Well, no, I don't think it is. All of this hawk behaviour, the symphony that I talked about, is there for a purpose. Do they want the DRUs back? Absolutely. It's a core part of the program. once a communist party has presided over the least egalitarian economic system in the whole of Asia, they've got to fall back on something. And the story that they do have is China's reclaiming its lost strength and grandeur, and the territorial story is a big part of that. Just to finish off, so how do you reconcile all of that? It's because when China seeks to expand its territorial influence, the backdrop, the show, the theatre is all the toys. Part of the backdrop, the show, is the hawks. If you don't take us seriously, look how mad we are. Do you really trust us not to press the button? That's part of the show. But the core parts of the show are the economic levers and the cross-court, the full-court diplomatic press. It's about economic leverage. It's about advertising China in a certain way, and it's about the threat of force, all combined. So I think that's very true in China's eyes to reclaim its lost territorial sovereignty. They're taking great risks to get it back, but in ways that are very different to how we're used to. I've probably gone over my little slot. I'm sorry about that, Ben, but I'm looking forward to the questions and the conversation.